Hi everyone! I'm Claris. I'm an indie author and poet, and you might have noticed that this is a different setup this time. I am so pleased to share that I have gotten Dianna Gunn, who is in charge of the Weeknight Writers Chat on Blue Sky, to join me in this little video on hot takes that we have on prologues and epilogues. Dianna, do you want to share a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I write fantasy and horror books. I just released my gothic horror novel, Woman of Sorrow and Blood, last month. And I also run Weeknight Writers, which is not just a Blue Sky chat, but a variety of virtual events and programming for fiction writers. And we have a lot of fun, and I have a lot of thoughts on prologues and epilogues, so I'm excited to get into this.
All right. Yeah, I first learned about weeknight writers through the Blue Sky chat online, and so that's how I got to know everybody there and you especially. Actually, so it's been really fun interacting online every Thursday night, learning
Yeah,
about
it's a great time. We get to meet lots of cool people.
yeah, for sure. Okay, so the reason this collab came up between us is because we realized we had learned that there were some people out there that apparently skip reading the prologues and epilogues. And so we've realized that, and as writers ourselves who have written prologues and epilogues or have at least read a lot of them in our lifetime, we couldn't help but just wonder why? What is the logic behind this? Behind this, why would they do something like that? So, firstly, to kind of start off this discussion, since we are writers ourselves, why do we writers write prologues and epilogues?
So I think it's a way of framing the story, and in my case, in Moonshadow's Champion, which was my second full-length novel, very specifically, the prologue happened because it was in a POV that is not used throughout most of the book, and I really needed to have readers see this information that my other viewpoint characters don't get to have. And I think that is, in my experience, other than, there was this trend in, I think like 70s, 80s fantasy where it was just like every book had a prologue of the main character being born. But generally, I think the use is just to give you information that the point of view character for the rest of the book isn't going to have. At least that's how I most often see it used and how I've seen it used myself. Whereas epilogues are often still in the main viewpoint, but they're sort of after the story and they give you like a nice sort of a follow-up to let you know that the characters' journeys continue. Or in a series, sometimes they will be in, like the villain's point of view or something to set up the next book.
Oh yeah. Speaking of the villain's point of view, I remember reading the Rainbow Magic series by Daisy Meadows, and every single book starts off with this little rhyme that is shown in Jack Frost's point of view. Jack Frost is like the recurring main villain throughout the series, and he's always causing trouble trying to steal specific items from a specific set of fairies in order to achieve his evil purposes. So, for example, the weather fairies he would talk about in the little poem as like the prologue for, oh, I've stolen all of these weather fairies items or wands or whatever, and so I'll be controlling all of the weather, and so on and so forth. And I just thought it was a fun way to start the book and give readers that information in such an interesting way.
Yeah, that's a really fun take on prologues.
Yeah, for sure. I'm kind of tempted to try to put some prologue poetry in my later books for sure. I also, as somebody who doesn't really write a lot of prologues myself, I do notice that there is a lot of foreshadowing involved in giving prologues. And it's kind of, as you mentioned earlier, it's good for like to be that great framing tool so the reader knows about a specific thing, but the main character might not. But I also think it's a good way to show like the beginnings of like an overarching plot that might take place not just in book one, but also in the rest of the books too.
Absolutely. I think that use is more often for epilogues, but sometimes it is in prologues. And sometimes often what you'll get is in the prologue, it's kind of subtly there, and like as a reader, you wouldn't notice it until you're rereading the series. But in the epilogue, it's very like overtly like, no, this is the setup for the next book. This is what the villain is up to. Or, a side character who's about to become really important is up to. And I think that's a really valuable use for them. And I do think that prologues can be used in that way, but I feel like that has to be done more subtly because the prologue should be more directly tied to what is going to happen in the coming chapters.
Oh yeah, for sure. I do think it's a good way to tie in what will happen next for certain. So that's kind of like our take on prologues, but what about epilogues? We mentioned a bit about at the end, it's often can be used for foreshadowing for later books and for setting up more overarching arcs, but it could also give like a sense of completeness for the reader beyond the main context of the story. Like say, we finished the final boss, the day is saved. Here's what our heroes are up to after.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's one of the greatest uses of prologues because if you really love a set of characters, yeah, you do want them to see them, what's going to happen next. And, you know, it's really nice to get that, especially if you know there's not another book coming about those characters. So you get to have this one last final moment with them after all the dust has settled, and to see that their lives go on. And it can also be a really useful way for the writer to say, for real, these characters' stories are done. There are a lot of epilogues that happen many years after the story, or even just a few. The Hunger Games comes to mind, where you see her and Katniss has developed this peace in her life, and even though she still struggles with the nightmares sometimes, she's building her own family. She's doing these things that never would have been possible if she hadn't destroyed the world. But that also tells you her story is done because she overcame the challenges, she reshaped the world, and now she gets to go and have the peaceful, happy life that she never would have if she hadn't gone through the story.
Exactly. Yeah, Katniss's epilogue is such a great example. Ample. I wish I had like a specific epilogue that came to mind, but I just don't. It's like all the epilogues decided to vanish from my brain in the instant.
It's okay. It's like when someone asks me for book recommendations, half the time my brain just goes, I've never read a book in my entire life. What do you mean? Just all the titles of every book I've ever read just fall out of my head.
Yeah, for sure. But knowing what the prologue and epilogue can bring, what was your initial reaction when you found out when some readers just straight up skip these sections?
I mean, first of all, I was confused. I don't know why you would. I mean, maybe I can kind of understand not reading the epilogue in like very specific circumstances because I know that sometimes you feel obligated to finish a book even if you're not really enjoying it. Or, you might finish the book and you might be so mad at like the final chapter that you don't want to read anything more. So I understand in those instances that maybe you're not going past the final chapter. You're just like, no, I read the final page of the main story. I'm out. But I can't understand why you'd do that for a book you were actually enjoying. And on a more personal note, I will say that anyone who skips prologues is going to be really missing out if they read Moonshadow's Champion, which is my second book, because that prologue is one of the best things I've ever written.
Yeah, I totally understand if you want to skip the epilogue because you're just done with the story and you hate it. I've had those moments several times with the books I've disliked. So, because I just would not root for the main characters at all. And then I'm like, what do you mean they get to have like one last chapter? Goodbye, I don't want to see you again. But with the prologues, when I first learned that people were skipping prologues, I was just like, why? Like, if you had seen me in the moments, I would have been like the personification of the screaming emoji. I just legitimately did not understand why would you want to miss something that's the equivalent of a bonus scene in movies that has some cool lore world building or gives like that cliffhanger to the next movie. It's like, why? It's like, why would you miss out on something, especially if you enjoyed the story?
Yeah, and it's not even like a Marvel movie where you have to sit through 10 minutes of credits to get the bonus
Oh my
scene.
gosh.
I hate that so much.
Yeah, I hate that so much. It's effective, but I hate it so much.
Yo,
But yeah, knowing that there are like some readers that do skip prologues and epilogues, does it ever make you think like, oh, maybe I shouldn't bother with like having this specific kind of chapter in or out of like your future works?
um, not necessarily. I will always do what the story demands. Now, there is sometimes a debate about whether I call the first thing a prologue or a chapter one.
Hmm.
Like in my first full-length book, there's a big time skip between chapter one and chapter two, and I considered actually making chapter one a prologue, but it's in the same POV as chapter two and the rest of the book. Well, most of the rest
Oh.
of the book. So I decided to make it chapter one despite the big time skip. In my current book, I actually had a prologue, like the one that I'm currently writing. I had what was initially a prologue because the POV character was only going to play a minor role, but she has since grown to take up a much larger role in the story. So I've just retitled it as Chapter 1 because now that she's a major player, it makes more sense. And I'm always gonna follow that and go with what the story demands. And I do think in, what I'm writing now is closer to epic fantasy, and I think in like specifically epic fantasy, my books are a bit on the short side to really be epic fantasy, but they're very much in that vein. And in epic fantasy, epilogues are just kind of they're almost expected.
Oh, right.
Um, so I do suspect I don't know that I'll have one in the current book that I'm writing, but I know when I reach the end of the series, then I will have an epilogue. And I don't feel weird about that because I do feel like that's a genre expectation. The other thing that I've seen some people recommend, though, is that actually maybe it's just the word prologue these people don't like, so you could call it anything else. You could call it before, you could call it prelude. If you just don't use the word prologue, people won't see it as something skippable, which knowing it sounds silly, but knowing what I know about how the human brain works, I actually believe that could be quite effective.
Yeah, I had not considered like genre expectations going into it because I do agree that prologues and epilogues, those are more available. They're more commonly seen in like fantasy, especially epic fantasy, as you mentioned. But for something like, say, a murder mystery or like, well, maybe in cozy fantasy, probably there I've seen some in a few. But maybe like in a thriller book or something like that, they might not be as likely
Yeah, or
or as
even urban
available.
fantasy, I don't really see a lot of prologues and epilogues,
Yeah,
but
no, they're pretty rare.
I feel like it's mostly in secondary world fantasy. So things that take place not on Earth, sort of more regardless of the genre, like the subgenre that they fall into. And I suspect that that's because when you're not on Earth, there's so much more setup you need to do that it's just a lot easier to lay out some of the lore in a prologue.
Yeah, for sure. Thinking of like it being in like a secondary world or something, it does make me consider like sci-fi. I have read some prologues and epilogues in like sci-fi novels, but it also makes me think of Star Wars where they have the opening credits of like in a galaxy far, far away, etc., etc., etc.
The iconic scroll. Yeah, I
Yes.
I don't read nearly as much sci-fi, to be completely honest. I watch a ton of sci-fi, but I don't read it very much. So I'm not really up and up on the trends there.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not as big on reading and writing sci-fi either, and not often ones that take place between planets. It's
Yeah.
usually like the futuristic type of sci-fi, and then it's getting scarier and scarier because of all of the talk of AI going on in our present time.
Yeah. I'm really not enjoying the many ways that the dystopian fiction that I grew up with feels more and more realistic and plausible every day.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I guess in terms of writing prologues and epilogues for myself, in my currently published books and in one of my upcoming books, Found, which is a short story collection. Obviously, short story collections don't really have prologues and epilogues because each of the stories are supposed to be self-contained stories, so it really wouldn't apply there. As for my other books, I have considered writing epilogues. I did previously consider writing epilogues for my murder mystery books, the Harlow Mystery series, but I just felt that it didn't really fit at the end, especially when I wanted to make them feel like somewhat like it's like they're in a series, but I also wanted to make sure it was easy for a reader to pick up at least the first two books, kind of like standalones. So that's a reason I did not add epilogues to those.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's really important to consider the context. And like for example, the book I just released, it doesn't have an epilogue in it because I really wanted it to feel self-contained.
Hmm.
But at the end, I was convinced to write like a bonus story about one of the side characters as a follow-up. So I did that and I've made it if you actually get to the very end of the book and you go to where the about the author would usually be, you're greeted by a page saying sign up to get this free short story. And I did that instead of an epilogue because I really just wanted the story of my main characters to be self-contained, and I think considering that is really important. So that brings the question to you. If you felt your story, something you were working on, did merit a prologue or an epilogue and it fit, would you be enthusiastic about writing that, or would you hesitate based on what we've just learned about people skipping things?
I think if the story merits like putting in a prologue or epilogue, then heck yeah, I'm gonna go for it. You can only please so many readers and so many people. And even though there may be a lot of people that don't like prologues and epilogues, there are also a lot of people who are completely fine with it or neutral or absolutely love it. I have gotten into like reading some books purely because of the prologue, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, the prologue is amazing. And yeah, even though the rest of the book disappointed me, they still had a good prologue. I had to admit that.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that.
Is there anything else that you want to add on the whole prologue epilogue debates in particular?
Honestly, I think it's just silly that people skip them. I mean, it's not like you're saving a ton of time. These are usually like two or three scenes, two or three pages long, maybe five. You're reading a whole book. You're committed to reading a whole book. Why wouldn't you read the first and last few pages. Unless, like I said, at the end, you're like, I've finished this book. I can say I finished this book. I don't want to go near the epilogue because I just hate everyone involved in this. That I understand. But otherwise, you've committed to reading, 150, 200, 300, or even more pages. What is the difference if you add another five?
Yeah, that is a really good point. I would be interested to see what readers have to say about this in the comments below this video for sure. But yeah, with that in mind, thank you so much, Diana, for speaking with me about the whole prologue epilogue situation going on. Are there any? I'll have Diana's links in the description below, so please make sure to go check those out. Do you have any last words? Do you have anything that you'd like to plug before we
Uh,
close this?
Thank you for having me. And for readers who don't like prologues or epilogues, you will find neither in my most recent release, Woman of Sorrow and Blood, which you can find out more about at authordiannagunn.com. That's two N's in Diana and two N's in Gunn. And if you are a fellow writer, do check out Weeknight Writers. We do a whole lot of really cool stuff. Right now, at the end of May, we have an upcoming virtual conference about disability in writing, and I'd love to see some of you folks there. And you can find out about that at weeknightwriters.com. And also, thank you so much for having me, Claris. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. And with that in mind, I guess I'll see all of you readers next time. Bye.